In an increasingly interconnected world, where flows of information and capital cross borders with astonishing speed, a fundamental, almost archetypal tension emerges between two radically opposed visions of the organization of human society. On one side stands the bastion of individual liberty, personal sovereignty, and the spontaneous order that flourishes in the absence of centralized coercion, a vision robustly defended by the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises and his intellectual successors. On the other, a multifaceted force advances, frequently associated with globalist agendas and a new world order, which seems to advocate for increasing centralization of power, global regulatory harmonization, and, crucially, stricter control over the tools that define the very essence of economic interaction, money. This analytical essay proposes to delve into the depths of this ideological battle, dissecting not only the theoretical arguments but also the practical manifestations of this dispute, particularly concerning the proposals for central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and other forms of monetary control that threaten to redefine the relationship between the individual and the state on an unprecedented scale. Far from being a mere academic debate, this is a contest whose implications reverberate in the foundations of our civilization, questioning the very nature of freedom in a digital age. Will the promise of efficiency and security offered by new centralized monetary technologies be a veil that conceals a digital leviathan, ready to swallow the autonomy that Mises considered the cornerstone of human progress? Or is resistance to these innovations merely an anachronistic attachment to outdated ideals, incapable of dealing with the complexity of the 21st century? The answer, as often happens in matters of such magnitude, is not simple, but the search for it is imperative. Ludwig von Mises's philosophy, anchored in praxeology, the study of human action as purposeful behavior, offers a radically different starting point from that adopted by the proponents of centralization. For Mises, society is not a monolithic entity to be molded by benevolent planners, but a complex fabric of voluntary interactions among individuals who act based on their own values, knowledge, and expectations. Social and economic order emerges spontaneously from these actions, not from a decree. The market, in this context, is not just a mechanism for allocating resources, but a process of continuous discovery, where prices, profits, and losses act as vital signs, guiding entrepreneurs in satisfying the most urgent needs of consumers. Any attempt to replace this process with central planning, Mises argued vehemently, is doomed to failure, not because of the planner's bad intentions, but because of the intrinsic impossibility of rational economic calculation in the absence of private ownership of the means of production and, consequently, of genuine market prices for capital goods. This fundamental critique of socialism and any form of massive state intervention in the economy is the lens through which the Austrian school analyzes contemporary trends of centralization. Adam Smith's invisible hand finds in Mises its most rigorous logical foundation. Order does not need to be imposed from above, it arises from below, from the myriad of individual actions coordinated by the price system. The question, then, is, how does this vision clash with the rise of proposals that seem to move in the diametrically opposite direction? The narrative that drives many globalist agendas, on the other hand, often relies on distinct premises. It starts from the idea that modern challenges, whether pandemics, climate change, economic inequality, or financial instability, are too complex to be left to the mercy of chaotic individual interactions or the idiosyncrasies of national sovereignties. The solution, according to this view, lies in greater international coordination, the harmonization of rules, and, ultimately, the delegation of power to supranational entities or technocrats seen as more capable of managing the global commons. Monetary control emerges as a central tool in this project. If money is the lifeblood of the economy, controlling its issuance, circulation, and even its individual use offers immense power to direct social and economic behavior on a large scale. It is argued that national fiat currencies, subject to the political whims of each country, are sources of instability and inefficiency. Digitalization, then, offers a unique opportunity to create more efficient, secure, and inclusive monetary systems, centrally administered, perhaps even globally. The promise is to overcome the limitations of the current financial system, combat illicit activities, and facilitate the implementation of macroeconomic policies. But beneath this surface of modernity and efficiency, what hidden mechanisms may be at play? Would we be exchanging freedom, with its imperfections and uncertainties, for a golden cage of control and predictability? The Misesian critique suggests that this exchange is not only undesirable but also illusory, since the order promised by centralization would be inherently fragile and devoid of the adaptive vitality of the free market. One of the most evident and disturbing mechanisms in this centralizing trend is the proposal and active development of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Presented as the natural evolution of money in the digital age, a state response to private cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, CBDCs represent, in practice, a radical qualitative change in the nature of money and in the relationship between the citizen and monetary power. Unlike physical money, notes and coins, which allows for anonymous and direct transactions between parties, and even unlike the current digital bank money, which, although traceable, still involves private intermediaries and a certain degree of fragmentation, a CBDC would be a direct liability of the central bank, recorded in a centralized ledger and controlled by it. This means that, potentially, every transaction carried out by every individual could be monitored, recorded, and analyzed in real time by the monetary authority. Financial privacy, a fundamental pillar of individual liberty, allowing people to spend their money as they see fit without needing the approval or knowledge of the state, would be effectively abolished. Mises, who saw money as an emergent social institution, chosen by the market for its ability to facilitate exchanges and preserve value, would be horrified by the idea of money that functions primarily as a tool of surveillance. The shift from a system where money is a neutral instrument of exchange to one where it is a vehicle of social control is profound. Imagine a scenario where access to your own funds can be instantly blocked based on political, social, or behavioral criteria defined by the state. Think of the possibility of programmable money, where certain purchases are prohibited, or where money expires, if not spent within a certain period to stimulate consumption, or where negative interest rates are applied directly to individual accounts to penalize savings. These are not dystopian fantasies, but technically viable functionalities and, in some cases, openly discussed by proponents of CBDCs. The alleged efficiency masks a potential for tyranny unprecedented in human history. The ability to carry out anonymous or pseudonymous transactions, which physical money and some cryptocurrencies offer, is an essential safeguard against arbitrary power. Eliminating this possibility under the pretext of combating crime or increasing efficiency is to hand the state absolute control over the economic life of citizens, transforming every act of buying or selling into a permitted and monitored interaction. The Austrian critique here is clear: economic freedom is inseparable from personal freedom. Restricting one inevitably stifles the other. The CBDC, in this sense, is not just a technological innovation, but a political instrument of immense potential power. Another insidious mechanism, intrinsically linked to the architecture of the modern financial system that globalists seek to reform or consolidate, is the very nature of fiat money and the policy of chronic inflation that it allows. Mises, in his seminal work, The Theory of Money and Credit, already unveiled the dangers of monetary manipulation by the state. He argued that money should emerge from the market as a useful commodity, like gold or silver historically, possessing intrinsic value and being difficult to produce arbitrarily. This guarantees its soundness and reliability as a medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. In contrast, the global fiat system, definitively established after the abandonment of the gold standard in 1971, allows central banks and governments to create money out of nothing, without backing in any real asset. This capacity, although justified under the aegis of flexible macroeconomic management, functions in practice as a hidden and regressive form of taxation, inflation. By expanding the money supply, the purchasing power of existing monetary units decreases, transferring wealth from money holders, especially wage earners and savers, to those who receive the new money first: governments, large banks, politically connected corporations, the so-called Cantillon effect. Mises saw this practice not only as economically destructive, by distorting price signals, generating boom and bust cycles, and discouraging savings, but also as morally corrupt, as it allows the state to finance its spending without resorting to explicit and politically unpopular taxation. Globalist agendas, by proposing greater coordination between central banks and potentially even a global digital currency, may exacerbate this trend. A CBDC, for example, would greatly facilitate the implementation of aggressive inflationary policies and even the direct application of negative interest rates on citizens' balances, eliminating the possibility of flight to physical money. The official narrative frequently masks inflation as a natural or inevitable phenomenon, or even as a desirable goal, inflation targets of 2%, for example. However, from the Misesian perspective, inflation is almost always a monetary phenomenon resulting from deliberate policies of expanding the money supply. The pursuit of stability through centralized monetary management paradoxically generates systemic instability and erodes the purchasing power and financial freedom of individuals. Sound money, defended by Mises, is not a fetish for precious metals, but a principle. Money should be a neutral and reliable instrument, protected from the arbitrary manipulation of political power. Chronic inflation, facilitated by the fiat system and potentially turbocharged by future centralizing innovations, is a direct attack on this principle and, by extension, on individual economic sovereignty. Advancing in the analysis, we come across a third mechanism, the growing web of international regulation and harmonization, often promoted by supranational organizations, such as the IMF, the World Bank, the BAS, the UN, the World Economic Forum. Although international cooperation can be beneficial in certain areas, the observed trend is to create uniform global standards that, under the pretext of facilitating trade or ensuring financial stability, end up stifling regulatory competition between nations and imposing a single model, often favorable to established interests, and greater centralization of power. Mises was a defender of free trade and international peace, but saw genuine cooperation as the result of voluntary interaction between free individuals and nations, not the imposition of rules by global bureaucracies. Regulatory harmonization, especially in areas such as finance, the environment, ESG, environmental, social, governance agendas, and even social policies, can function as a government cartel. It prevents countries from experimenting with different approaches and citizens and businesses from voting with their feet, seeking jurisdictions with more favorable environments for freedom and prosperity. This dynamic creates barriers to entry for new competitors, solidifies the power of large corporations that can bear the costs of compliance and navigate the regulatory complexity, and, crucially, transfers decision-making power from democratically elected bodies, or, ideally, from individuals themselves in the market, to committees of unelected technocrats in Geneva, Brussels, or Washington. The implementation of CBDCs, for example, would likely be accompanied by international standards to ensure interoperability, but also to impose common rules of surveillance and control. Similarly, the pressure for uniform ESG metrics for investment evaluation can direct capital centrally, based on political and ideological criteria, rather than the risk and return assessments made by individual investors in the market, a profound distortion of the capital allocation process that Mises considered essential. This subtle global governance, which operates through recommendations, standards, and agreements that gradually become compulsory, represents an erosion of national sovereignty and, more fundamentally, of individual sovereignty. It creates an environment where decisions that profoundly affect people's lives are made in distant forums, by actors with little or no accountability, masking the concentration of power. Under the language of cooperation and global risk management, the diversity of laws and customs, which Mises would see as a laboratory for the discovery of the best forms of social organization, is replaced by a global straitjacket. A fourth mechanism, perhaps the most ethereal, but no less powerful, is the management and control of the narrative. Ideas, as Mises well knew, are the true driving forces of history. Public acceptance of centralizing agendas depends crucially on the ability to shape collective perception, to present these agendas not as controversial political choices, but as neutral, inevitable, or even morally superior technical solutions. This involves the co-option or influence over mass media, academic institutions, NGOs, and even the entertainment sector. Language is carefully calibrated. Surveillance becomes transparency or security. Social control is transformed into financial inclusion or social responsibility. Inflation is described as economic stimulus. The loss of sovereignty is sold as enhanced international cooperation. Concepts such as disinformation or hate speech can be instrumentalized to silence dissident voices that question the official narrative, especially those that defend principles of individual liberty, free markets, and limited government, such as those of the Austrian school. The promotion of certain crises, whether health, climate, or financial, is frequently accompanied by a media and expert chorus that demands centralized and urgent solutions, marginalizing any debate about costs, benefits, or decentralized alternatives. Mises emphasized the importance of the struggle of ideas and economic education to preserve freedom. He believed that only an informed citizenry capable of thinking critically about government proposals could resist the sirens of interventionism and socialism. Today, this struggle seems more unequal than ever, with vast resources being mobilized to promote a worldview that favors centralization and discredits alternatives based on freedom. The idea that experts and technocrats should guide society, ruled by experts, is actively cultivated, undermining confidence in the ability of individuals to make their own decisions and manage their own affairs. The very complexity of the proposed systems, such as CBDCs or the intricate mechanisms of international finance, serves as a barrier, making it difficult for the common citizen to fully understand their implications and participate in the debate in a meaningful way. The control of the narrative, therefore, is not just propaganda. It is a fundamental strategy to manufacture consent and neutralize opposition to agendas that, if fully understood, could face massive popular resistance. Intimately linked to narrative control is the mechanism of engineering consent through the exploitation of psychological biases and the creation of dependence. Centralizing proposals are rarely presented in their entirety all at once. Instead, they are introduced gradually, often in response to crises, real or perceived, exploiting the human desire for security and stability. The problem-reaction solution strategy is a classic example. A problem is created or exaggerated: financial instability, crime, exclusion. A public reaction of fear or indignation is provoked, and then a preconceived solution is offered that involves greater state control, stricter regulation, increased surveillance, CBDCs. Each step is small enough not to alarm the population excessively, but the cumulative direction is unmistakable. Furthermore, the very structure of the modern welfare state, with its vast network of subsidies, benefits, and free services, financed by taxes and inflation, creates a relationship of dependence that makes citizens more reluctant to challenge state power. Mises warned of the dangers of interventionism, arguing that each intervention in the market creates distortions that lead to demands for new interventions, in a vicious cycle that gradually leads to socialism or a state of comprehensive control. The introduction of a universal basic income, UBI, frequently discussed in conjunction with CBDCs, which would facilitate its distribution, could radically deepen this dependence. Although it may seem like a measure of compassion, a digitally distributed and centrally controlled UBI could become a powerful tool to ensure social and political conformity. Who would dare to criticize the system that guarantees their basic subsistence? Especially if that subsistence can be conditioned on good behavior. Human psychology is also exploited through the appeal to convenience. CBDCs and other centralized digital payment systems promise instant and easy transactions. In exchange for this convenience, people may, without realizing it, give up their privacy and financial autonomy. The comfort of the present obscures the risks of the future. Mises, with his emphasis on purposeful human action and the importance of time preferences, the valuation of the present over the future, would perfectly understand how the pursuit of immediate gratification and apparent security can lead people to accept invisible shackles. The battle for freedom, therefore, is not only economic or political, but also psychological, requiring a constant awareness of the long-term costs of the easy solutions offered by centralized power. Finally, one cannot ignore the role of technology as a facilitator and, at times, an autonomous driver of these centralizing trends. The digital revolution, with the proliferation of data, artificial intelligence, and ubiquitous connectivity, provides tools for monitoring and control that were unimaginable in previous eras, including that of Mises. While Mises analyzed the problems of economic calculation under socialism in terms of the impossibility of processing dispersed information, some modern proponents of centralization argue that big data and AI have overcome this obstacle. They believe that sophisticated algorithms can now plan the economy and society more efficiently than the chaos of the market. This is a dangerously technocratic vision, which ignores the fundamental nature of the tacit, subjective, and dispersed knowledge that Mises emphasized. The knowledge relevant to economic coordination is not just quantitative and capable of being collected in databases. It involves entrepreneurial insights, subjective preferences, and local contexts that are inherently decentralized and often inarticulate. Trying to replace the market process with a central supercomputer is to repeat the fatal error of socialism in a new digital guise. Worse still, digital technology greatly amplifies the potential for surveillance and control. CBDCs are just one example. Digital identity systems, facial recognition, social network monitoring, and predictive behavioral analysis, when combined and controlled by a central authority, create the infrastructure for a total surveillance state, a digital panopticon. The promise of security and efficiency again serves as justification. It is argued that these tools are necessary to combat terrorism, organized crime, or pandemics. However, the potential for abuse is immense. In authoritarian regimes, these technologies are already used to repress dissent and impose ideological conformity. Even in democracies, the temptation to use these powers for purposes of social control can be irresistible, especially in times of crisis. Technology, in itself, is neutral. It can be used to empower individuals, like decentralized cryptocurrencies, which Mises would probably view with interest, despite his criticisms of currencies without initial backing in commodities, or to strengthen centralized control. The current battle is largely about which of these visions will prevail. The Misesian perspective warns us to be deeply skeptical of technological solutions that promise centralized utopias, as they often ignore the complexity of human action and carry within them the seed of digital tyranny. Faced with this complex and, at times, bleak scenario, what would be the antidote? How can we resist the rising tide of centralization and preserve the spaces of individual and economic freedom that Mises considered essential for civilization? The answer, following the Austrian logic itself, does not lie in a central plan to combat central planning, but in a multiplicity of decentralized strategies, focused on strengthening the individual and limiting the reach of coercive power. First, education remains the most powerful weapon. Spreading the understanding of the principles of market economics, sound monetary theory, and the dangers inherent in the concentration of power is fundamental. The work of Mises and other thinkers of freedom needs to be rescued from academic obscurity and translated for the general public, exposing the fallacies of centralizing narratives and offering a coherent and attractive alternative vision. This includes demystifying the nature of inflation, explaining the risks of CBDCs, and questioning the supposed benevolence and omniscience of central planners. Second, it is crucial to defend and actively use the tools that promote individual autonomy. This may include using physical money whenever possible, exploring genuinely decentralized cryptocurrencies, despite their own challenges and volatility, as alternatives to state-controlled financial systems, and adopting communication and privacy technologies that resist surveillance. Asset diversification, including tangible goods or currencies with greater historical soundness, can also offer some protection against monetary devaluation and financial control. Third, political and civic resistance, although challenging, cannot be discarded. Supporting movements and candidates who explicitly defend the limitation of government, the decentralization of power, federalism, peaceful secession, economic freedom, and the protection of privacy is important. Equally vital is the legal and public contestation of measures that expand surveillance and state control, such as the implementation of CBDCs or invasive digital identity systems. The formation of resilient local communities, less dependent on centralized structures for their basic needs, can also be a form of practical resistance. Finally, and perhaps most importantly in the spirit of Mises, is the reaffirmation of individual responsibility. Freedom is not a free gift, it demands vigilance, courage, and the willingness to take responsibility for our own lives and choices. This means cultivating critical thinking, questioning dominant narratives, seeking independent knowledge, and acting according to our own values, even when it is inconvenient or unpopular. The battle between freedom and tyranny is fought not only in parliaments or central banks, but also in the mind and heart of every individual. The historical trajectory seems, at first glance, to lean towards centralization. From absolutist monarchies, through modern nation-states, and now towards forms of global governance, the concentration of power has been a constant, albeit with flows and ebbs. Digital technology seems to accelerate this trend, offering tools of control previously unthinkable. However, history also shows that human freedom is resilient. Empires fall, totalitarian ideologies collapse, and the search for autonomy resurfaces. The very digital revolution that allows surveillance also gave rise to decentralization. Tools like Bitcoin, showing that technology is a double-edged sword. Mises's analysis of the unsustainability of central planning and the superiority of the spontaneous order of the market remains profoundly relevant. Centralized systems, no matter how technologically sophisticated, are inherently fragile because they suppress the feedback and adaptation mechanisms that characterize complex and living systems, such as human society. They may seem efficient in the short term, but they accumulate errors and distortions that eventually lead to crises or collapse. The promise of a new world order, managed by enlightened technocrats, may be seductive to some, but history and Misesian economic theory warn us that such an order would be, at best, a managed stagnation and, at worst, a digital tyranny. The true order, the dynamic and progressive order that has allowed human flourishing in recent centuries, is the order of freedom, private property, voluntary exchange, and sound money, the spontaneous order that Mises so brilliantly defended. The battle to preserve this order against the forces of globalist centralization is, perhaps, the defining challenge of our time. It demands not only intellectual understanding, but also courageous action and a renewed commitment to the fundamental principles of individual liberty. The choice between a future where every transaction, every interaction, is monitored and controlled by a central power, and a future where individuals maintain their sovereignty over their lives and property, is before us. Ignoring this choice, or passively accepting the path of convenience and apparent security, is to risk losing what Mises considered the most precious good, freedom itself. The struggle may be long and arduous, but the alternative is unacceptable to those who value the dignity and autonomy of the human spirit.